Welcome to First Amendment Day. I'm Dr. Amanda Reed. I'm faculty co-director for the Center for Media Law and Policy, and I talk fast, but that's okay, because you're not going to listen to me for very long. I'm going to turn things over to our moderator, Dr. Francesca Tripodi. She is an associate professor at SIL, the School for Information and Library Science, and she's also a principal with CITAP, which has the beautiful acronym for Center for Information and Technology in Public Life. And I've got a most impressive panel that has been assembled of other CITAP friends. She knows their research very, very well. So she is a fantastic moderator for this event. And I'm going to turn things over. Welcome.
Thank you, Amanda. Is this giving you all experience? Okay, great. So my name is Francesca Tripodi. It's great to see some familiar faces and a lot of unfamiliar faces. I'm going to be moderating this panel today, and we're going to have everybody introduce their fabulous selves. These are three of my favorite people, actually, at the school, and I'm very, very fortunate that we get to work at a collaborative center, the Center for Information Technology and Public Life, which we just call CITAP. And we get to talk about a lot of these questions day in and day out. So I think, are we going in this order? No, okay, so this will be good. I'm going to turn it over to Shannon, who will be our first person. I'm gonna take some notes, then I'm gonna drive some questions based on how they open this panel. But we really wanna make it casual and informal and a conversation. So I'm hoping you all have some great questions and that you will participate.
Thank you. So hi, I'm Shannon McGregor. I'm an associate professor here in the Hussman School of Journalism and Media and a principal investigator with our Center for Information Technology and Public Life. So we're just going to try and tackle no small thing in this panel and thinking about why media and social media matter for elections, as well as for things like polarization and extremism. So I wanted to think about, media and social media are really important for a lot of reasons, but mainly because that's how we find out about things that we don't experience ourselves, right? At its sort of base level, right? So who gets heard, how they say it, where they say things, all has profound impacts on the context around politics and elections specifically. So I thought I would kind of talk through one example that I think shows two different ways of thinking about this. So I want to talk about the story, the narrative maybe, of Haitian immigrants eating pets in Springfield, Ohio. So here's a surface level way that we could look at this, right? It was a social media post. It was picked up by some sort of right-wing groups and sort of traveled in those social media spheres for a while. It eventually gets to the Republican vice presidential nominee, who starts talking about it, makes its way to the presidential debate stage where the former president and current Republican nominee repeats this story. It gets fact-checked, and it has had obviously chaotic, fearful, and damaging implications for the people who live in this community. So we can look at how it traveled through these different media spaces and across different actors, and we can talk about that it's not true, that even when it was starting to be spread by people who were saying it, they knew it wasn't true. But that's a surface level way of looking at it. I want us to think about this as an example of how we can look at how we can think about these things at a deeper level. Why did this one piece of disinformation travel so far and wide? And why did it have the power that it has had in our election narrative? It draws on centuries of racist and xenophobic tropes, in particular about Haitian immigrants. It conforms with what we think of as sort of a deep story about a white America and white nationalism and fears of immigrants. It's a story that gets attention because it's so outrageous sounding at the same time, even if that attention has been very negative, right, sort of in the main. And it causes chaos, and it causes fear, and it causes danger. And that's the point. Because this isn't just a story about social media disinformation. This is the story about identity and about who gets to be an American. And it's one that's designed to motivate people to action, including voting along those lines. Also designed to demotivate other types of people to not vote and to tee up the questioning of the election around who's participated in it and who ought to be. So I want to end though with a reminder to nuance. So many of those very same pathways that we described this particular story taking, but with different actors, but using the same tools, leveraging the same sort of affordances of different platforms and of our media system to spread sort of throughout this media and political system for movements towards a multiracial, multi-ethnic democracy. Those same tools, those same pathways, those same things happen for things that take us in a different direction towards democracy, like we saw with the Black Lives Matter movement and as part of the larger struggle for racial justice. So what I'm hoping to kick this off with is this idea that social media and disinformation, when we think about it in the context of election and politics, exists within the context of all of which we are living now and what came before us.
All right. Good afternoon. My name is Meredith Clark. I'm an associate professor of race and political communication here in the Hussman School of Journalism and one of the co-PIs in CITAP. My research focuses really broadly on race, media, and power and how the three intersect. And so with every question, with every problem that we come up against, I'm always asking questions about what race has to do with what we are talking about and how we're talking about it. And what media messages about race and identity have to do with the way that we're processing information. And so picking up on some of the threads that Shannon is putting down, I think about this Haitian immigrant story, and I make the connection because sitting and watching the debate and being reminded of what the former president actually said, he never in that moment mentioned specifically Haitian immigrants. And so I'm thinking about the power of news media to fill in gaps, for better or for worse, with information and provide a narrative, one that has been given to them by bad actors that they are amplifying uncritically. And this whole question of whether people are eating pets, which isn't just a rumor and disinformation that is about Haitian people, but also about other ethnic groups, including ethnic groups that the presidential nominee is from. It's longstanding in terms of evoking, as Shannon mentioned, this deep story, this one that we see recirculated in a number of ways. And if you are from one of these groups, I have to think that you are looking at what's being reported and how it's being discussed, and just wondering how we're going to move past this moment. What are things going to look like on the other side of this election? And that's what I've been thinking about when I try to describe why we're having these conversations to my family members and friends. And what I've come up with is that we are living in an age of absurdity. And if you accept that if we are in an age of absurdity, then things start to make a whole lot more sense. So traditionally in philosophy, when we think about absurdity, it is the difference between recognizing that there are no opportunities for us to really change our fate and then still trying to do it anyway. And if you are one of the people who are from these disempowered groups, from trapped populations who are forced to think about harm reduction and self-preservation and community preservation, and that drives your vote, you understand what it means to be in a place where everyone says that you have to vote for a particular candidate. That person is going to deliver us out of the problems that we're in and into this new era of democracy, and yet recognize that it's not going to happen. We haven't seen it happen with presidents past. We haven't seen it with civil rights leaders past. We know that there's no clear-cut way through this. And so as I think about this question of absurdity and information and how it is shared and how we deal with the realities that even though we have good information, we're able to share better information with people, we still may not be able to do what we need to do to move us out of a very racist and troubled public way of thinking about how we move forward as a country. I want to take up questions about how we keep people involved and engaged, and how we get them to continue to serve in their communities to address some of that misinformation, recognizing that the efforts, the tireless efforts that they're going to be putting in the next few weeks and months may not pay off in the way that people are promising that they will.
All right. It is always tough to follow, and always tough to follow too when I miss the memo on the block blazers. So I apologize. I'm Daniel Kreiss. I'm a professor here in the Hussman School and one of the principal researchers at the Center for Information Technology and Public Life as well. And generally my work for CITAP is focused on policies. So what policies do platform companies come up with around elections and also social issues broadly that balance the needs of their users, things like expression as a desired value, as well as trust and safety. Where do they draw those lines? And just what I'm going to sort of talk about today is sort of an opening framing piece, comes out of work that I've been doing with my fabulous RA, Morgan Neal. We've been collaborating for the last year or so on putting together comparative analysis of platform policies in the US and beyond when it comes to things like election violence, for instance, and voter suppression and the like. So I wanted to open just by talking about a few of the top line things, and I think this directly plays into exactly what Shannon and Meredith talked about. So in these cases, what do platforms do? When do they make decisions about leaving content out versus taking it down? The top line is this: platforms generally are guided by a value of free expression, which is very relevant here on First Amendment Day, and free expression, especially for political leaders. Political leaders have a lot more latitude to say and do things on platforms like Facebook than you or I do. And that's for a number of reasons, but the big one is it's because they're politically powerful, but it also is because most platforms sort of view it as a democratic good that voters are able to hear from those who are vying to represent them. There are some very clear categories where platforms do draw lines, although what lines they draw and how they draw them is often opaque and very contested. These are things like hate speech, expression that calls for things like violence, which a number of my students who are in my 101 class spent a long time thinking about in the context of Venezuela over the past week, as well as direct voter suppression. And I'll talk more about them maybe in the sort of Q&A. This idea of free expression as a guiding value for platforms outside of these some contexts comes from sort of a heady mix of early libertarian and countercultural inflected Silicon Valley, as well as more democratic and cultural ideas, right? So in the US, we have this First Amendment, and the First Amendment actually protects platforms from the government, not the other way around, right? So it doesn't protect government from platforms taking down content, all sorts of content, but it also doesn't protect you or I from Facebook taking down what we say. It's actually the First Amendment that protects Facebook and enables Facebook to set speech policies as they see fit. But in generally, what they want to do is preserve the widest possible lens of freedom of expression while also balancing that against trust and safety concerns. Why do they value expression? There's sort of three pieces to this. There's a business logic, an organizational logic, and a political logic. And then the fourth is a democratic logic. From a business perspective, all other things being equal, platforms ought to be cited for the widest possible audience, right? So they therefore want to facilitate a diverse range of expression. That said, they also have very clear commercial concerns, right? People don't want to spend time on platforms, or their kids to spend time on platforms, as we've seen with Instagram in the last week, that feature things like pornography or hate speech, right? So they want to allow expression, while they also want to make sure it's a place that people are going to continue wanting to come back to. And in fact, that's one of the reasons why Facebook and other platforms limit political content. because they have in their data that people don't want to spend time on sites that bombard them constantly with political content. It drives people away. So that's why they're limiting it in a number of countries around the world. Second, from an organizational perspective, it's easier to not moderate content, right? So it costs a lot of money to do content moderation. You have to develop policies, you have to monitor violations, you have to enforce decisions, you have to address lots of criticisms. And when somebody who's really powerful says you're censoring me, that then factors into how an organization will draw that line in the future. They don't want to be criticized, particularly when legislation and regulation might potentially be on the table. Finally, platform content moderation is informed by a democratic logic, which is sort of in the sense of it's an important democratic value that we have freedom of expression, right? It's enshrined in the UN Universal Declaration of Human Rights. It's also very much this feeling that we all have that we should be able to express ourselves in democracy. And that comes from the First Amendment as well as other sources. Okay, that said, there's an important tension here. Sometimes individual expression, especially by political elites who tell stories about immigrants eating pets, or who say that election is never going to be free and fair, or like in Brazil, who call supporters out into the streets to assault government buildings. Sometimes individual expression can silence collective expression, especially at the ballot box, right? As we saw on January 6th in this country, as we saw on January 8th in Brazil, as we saw in the wake of the Venezuelan elections, powerful political leaders can use what they claim is their right to expression in order to undermine the collective voices of those who have voted against them, have voted them out of office, who have said, we are no longer willing to be represented by you. And this is a very, very core tension. And we have some ideas and proposals about what we should do about it, but this is a central tension around this value of expression, is that sometimes elite expression can be used to silence the voice of the people. And as we've seen, anti-democratic leaders across the world have been weaponizing communication and media to do things like confusing electorates, undermining knowledge-producing institutions, eroding public epistemology, and eroding and evading accountability for their actions.
Wow.
For everybody. Okay, so I have a couple threads,
And I'm gonna start with these, and then I would love other people that wanna jump in here. So a central thing that I think connects a lot of what you all talked about today is the intimate role between content moderation, what gets to stay up on these platforms, why it does, as well as how that content moderation is processed. So one thing that sticks out to me is that often content moderation is hinging on the epistemology. Is it true? X, Y, Z. But what you all are talking a lot about, and what my own research talks a lot about, is the ontological role of this info, the deep story, and even J.D. Vance himself, right, said, doesn't really matter if it's true. If it's a story that I need to tell, then that's what we're gonna do. So I would love for any of you all, or all of you all, to kind of think about this tension, because in a platform that's designed to moderate content largely on these epistemological grounds, and then the fuzzy, the hate speech, the pornography, which another, is it? I'll leave it there. Yeah, so like that, I would love y'all to talk a little bit about this tension between the content moderation and then where we come and why that matters.
and I'll add like one more layer into that. Even, we're here in a journalism school. I'll add into this also the sort of epistemological aspect of fact checking,
Yeah.
right? And, this is captured the imagination of journalists and journalism. In particular, I would say in the last, oh my gosh, I guess it's been over 10 years. When I say that out loud, I'm realizing how long it's been. And that, I think this sets up this idea is like, is this the right tool to address what is the problem? If you see this as a problem of information, right? That like if people just had the right information, then they would make better for them, right? And hopefully better for our society and for our country choices about whom to elect or whom to amplify, et cetera, then you're gonna answer this with fact checking, or you're gonna create content moderation policies around whether a post is true or false. But it's not about information, right? It's not about discrete pieces of information. It's about information that ties into these deep stories. It's about information that ties into our identities and our senses of self. And so correcting, even if you can correct a discrete piece of mis or disinformation, even if you can content moderate it off a certain platform, that doesn't do much usually to impact the story and the narrative, and there will just be another piece of disinformation that can sort of serve to feed this larger narrative. And it is also the case, decades and decades now of political science research and others that shows that people mostly do not make voting decisions, if we're here talking about elections, based on information like rational people reading the newspaper and going to political events and then having to think about it and making decisions. That doesn't mean they're making bad decisions, by the way. Most people can make really good voting decisions for themselves based on really little cues like heuristics of parties or other things. But we're still operating in this model, like people are going out and getting information and having to think about it and making decisions. If we instead understand and incorporate this idea that people are making these decisions based in much larger stories about who they think, in the case of the US election, who they think the country is, who they think they are, and how that fits into what stories they have about themselves and about the country, then I think we would see that these things are perhaps necessary, but not useful.
I'm still thinking about it. So I'm thinking about the question of content moderation and really that statement that J.D. Vance makes about whether the story is true or not, and how it underscores this point about an era of absurdity. We know that between 2013 and 2016, that there were international bad actors who were on platforms who were purposefully spreading racialized misinformation. And there we have plenty of research that shows us that it did have an impact. And we have to question why they chose the types of mis and disinformation that they used, why they targeted it at particular communities, and why, even with the creation of content moderation policies and new standards and new guidelines for dealing with this mis and disinformation, we're still having to address the same issues. And it's because we are trying to adopt policy solutions to what are cultural problems that have been codified in both our laws and our practices. Racialized disinformation builds on historical stories that we have about the other. And it doesn't matter what context we're in terms of different countries, different languages, what have you, as long as there is someone that you can position as part of an outgroup, you can create a story that can mobilize people to act in different ways according to whatever your agenda is. So we can create all kinds of policies that flag different language, that flag different myths and untruths and what have you, and they still will not address cultural histories and historical laws that have reinforced in public imagination that these people are different, they are not like us, and thus we should vote and act in ways that suppress them and their freedom. And I think until we really make that part of our calculus on not only content moderation, but even just how we think about information, what spreads, what gets repeated, what gets amplified, we're going to continue to be on this hamster wheel trying to solve this problem every single election cycle. So to throw back to 2013, 2014, 2015, 2016, just to bring it all to a close, in 2017, when Black women, particularly in Alabama, went to the polls and voted for Doug Jones as opposed to, what was Roy's last name? Moore, thank you. Instead of Roy Moore, who was accused of sexual impropriety, right? When they went to the polls and cast their vote in the interest of democratic society, everyone tweeted and said, listen to Black women will save us, they're gonna do this, that, and the third. And I have to look back at all of the accolades that Black women were given in this moment and bring it up to 2024 and say we learned absolutely nothing. Because rather than actually listening to Black women and recognizing how race and racism was being used to perpetuate misinformation and to guide and steer campaigns and position candidates in specific ways, we just kind of went back to what we're used to. Let's add some more policy guidelines, let's flag different kinds of language, and not necessarily address the problem. So where I'm thinking about all of this together is that we cannot address these problems. We cannot address the untrue stories until we address our racial history and our history of othering and thinking about different people in ways that subjugate them.
Plus 150 to everything that Meredith just said. I think like where content moderation comes in to your question is so far downstream of culture and politics that there are little things platforms can do. And I think there's little things they should do, which is what I want to focus on now. But I think that's not to mistake this larger, deeper issue of how do we create truly multi-ethnic, multiracial democracies that are premised on solidarity for all of us and equality for all of us, not for a circumscribed few. And that is the challenge, sadly, not only of our time, but of every generation's time that has been in the history of this country. It's our responsibility, it's our obligation as survivors of the political systems that we are born into. Now, what role can platforms play into this? Morgan and I argue that they should create power-conscious policies. Policies that do not treat every social group equally under some abstract standard that everyone has the same opportunity to speak. Everyone's stories are equally represented in the public sphere. Everyone's truths are equally represented in the public sphere, and everyone is equally vulnerable to bad information, because none of those things are true, right? Social groups exist in the United States, despite claims that we're all Americans, and those social groups have very differential social power, right? And social power affects whose stories get told and how they get told. It affects who has representation among the faculty at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill and who does not. It affects the composition of our student bodies. It affects those who have access to opportunity and those whose voices are going to be most heard when it comes to telling the story of America, right? So what platforms I think can realistically do is say, in this particular case, to get specific, that a story told about a vulnerable immigrant group that resulted in threats, a lot of threats, if you followed the story of what happened on the ground, should be considered a piece of disinformation targeted at a marginalized group, and therefore, people don't have a right to say it on their platforms. I think platforms can draw a very bright line around that and say, no, there is a clear harm here. One of the things that we've argued for is platforms should have race-conscious policies. Policies that actually take into account the racialized nature of mis and disinformation, and therefore set brighter lines against non-dominant groups, because non-dominant groups need more of an opportunity to participate on those platforms precisely because voices of those groups are not represented in wider cultures, and are often the subject of these racialized disinformation campaigns. right? So that's just sort of one proposal that we've like laid out. Again, I think this is far downstream, but if part of this work is creating new solidarities, new conceptions of citizenship that are premised on inclusivity, then we all have a stake in having those stories be elevated and countering those counter stories that look to target vulnerable people and frankly mobilize dominant groups, dominant white groups in the United States against racialized others in defense of their status and their privilege.
And I just want to say quickly to sort of, got me thinking about this as you were talking about it, we're here First Amendment Day, that like, this is one of the core problems that I have with this concept of the marketplace of ideas, is that it's sort of this idea that we all of our voice, all of our ideas are just, they're all on the same level, they all have the exact opportunity to reach other people and make an impact. It's just not true. It's not true in life, and it's not true on social media platforms. And so I think, really challenging the way we think about that, and really challenging that as like a concept of like the answer to bad speech is more speech. I would just toss that out.
Can I also pick that up, because both of you sort of lean towards what Marianne Franks talks about with fearless speech and reframing the way that we even think about something like the First Amendment and the broad conceptualization that the public has, that I can say what I want because the First Amendment says that I can, and I should be able to say it on any platform in any way and not really experience repercussions. Whereas Franks, who's a legal scholar, gets us to think about what it means to be a disempowered person or from a disempowered group, and how, depending on the relationship you have to someone who is in power, their speech can do untold damage to your life, your ability to exist, right? And so that we should, as Daniel's talking about policies, think about what it means to amplify the speech of marginalized people in very specific ways to counteract what we know to be an existent power dynamic.
I'm gonna complicate it a little bit with some of the work on disinfo in like the Philippines and with the Vietnamese community. Because what a lot of their work says is that by building these deep stories around communism and the lies that are told outside these power groups, right, that claim that the Democratic Party is trying to enact communism, that threat of communism very much sticks within immigrant communities who have come here. And because there is not enough information in their language, the people who are, the YouTube channels that they're tuning into kind of perpetuate this lie. So I'd love for us to think about like, how do we address this, or what's the issue there, especially with regards to journalism? I think there's an easy one, right? More journalism in other languages, but then we also know journalism isn't being funded and local journalism. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on their work too, and how, because these are marginalized communities, especially here, but then the deep story has been enacted in a way that's almost like impossible to counter, at least from what these researchers are saying. So I don't know, what do y'all think about that?
I have first draft thoughts.
That's fine.
First draft, so this isn't, refined or anything. But I think we have to consider again power dynamics and specifically what existing schema these populations are grappling with as they're encountering information that positions a boogeyman of communism, right? These populations are people who have firsthand and first or second generation experience with communism, right? And with particularly abuses of communism. And so again, thinking about the racialized nature of misinformation The fact that we export democracy without considering the context in which it's experienced in other countries, or the way that it isn't experienced in other countries, we miss the opportunity to connect narratives that can correct fears about governing in one way and how one particular party might use power, because we just simply think that democracy is the best system. We export it in the same way that it's enacted here, and everyone should adopt that and be down with it. If we look at history and we look at the experiences that people in countries who don't look like us, who don't speak the same language, who have very, very, very different experiences with government, then we begin to develop remedies that help us address misinformation according to the cultural schema that they're already dealing with, the schema that they already have in order to understand the world.
Anyone else want to add to it? I'd love to open it up to the group. What do you all want to ask?
So I really appreciate you all covered a lot about the background. But I was just wondering, that do you feel that the media thrives on a love and hate relationship with Donald Trump? Despite all his fallacies and all his false things that he shares. Thank you.
I mean, right, like we live in an attention economy, even if we're thinking about more mainstream, type of news. It's about attention. Attention is about dollars, and we live in late stage capitalism, and so they need to make money, right? I'm not like excusing the behavior, by the way, I'm just kind of laying it out. So yeah, right, like things that get attention. But I will say though, I do think there is a really hard tension that journalists and that news organizations grapple with, is how do you cover a candidate, whether it's for president or if it's in your area, say like your state, like you're a gubernatorial candidate, who says and does things that are generally regarded to be as outside of what is socially acceptable, questions the outcome of free and fair elections and tries to, cast doubt on future ones. But they're a major party candidate for a major office, right? Like, do you just not cover them at all? That's probably not the answer, right? How do you cover that person with the context that is important and appropriate for your audiences to understand? Some work that I have been doing with some students here, also with my colleague Daniel as well, is thinking about this idea of like democracy frames journalism. So rather than, again, just pointing out that something that someone said isn't true, pointing out that it's not only not true, but that here are the democratic implications of these kinds of statements or actions, right? Saying this is false and makes people less likely to vote, or on purpose cast doubt on the election so that we can, sort of foment fears about that. So laying out, again, I'm going to say the word context, I guess, like 100 times today. But, providing that important context, because the truthiness is not, I think, at least this is what I'll say that we agree. The truthiness is not the core of it, right? And so having that context around it, in particular, the context around the democratic implications, especially around elections, I think is really important. But man, listen, I'm on the internet. I love to hate on New York Times coverage of really anything in the world. It seems like this is what we do on the internet. But I also do not envy individual journalists trying to make these decisions, because I think there are better answers than what we're getting. But I don't think these are necessarily easy questions to deal with from a coverage perspective.
Yeah, I guess I would only add to that. So I'm a small D Democrat. right? Like you have to be willing to lose an election. And you have to then also say you're gonna compete for the next one, right? Like this competitive elections is the bedrock of any theory of democracy. It's called a minimalist version of democracy for a reason, right? Like it is the one thing we all have to agree on, right? So for me, I think that you asked about the love-hate relationship, right? Like, so we know the love, it's attention, it's money. Some of it is norms and patterns of behavior, as Shannon was sort of pointing out. Some of it is like stupidity, to be honest, right? So like, everyone was talking about immigrants eating pets coming out of that debate. That's exactly what Trump and Vance wanted. That's why they doubled down afterwards, right? Like that's the story, and it's a story in many different ways, right? So like, but this is time and again, right? Like reporting on when a candidate says an election is not going to be fair. Even to debunk it is giving amplification and oxygen to those rumors, right? So I think like the issue and the challenge that I have with the media, and this is where the hate comes in. Like I want you to do the right thing. It's like where the hate comes in is like literally journalists rely on competitive elections to be able to continue to do their jobs. And if they're not willing to treat election denialism for what it is, if they're not willing to not give a platform to people who would undermine illegitimately people's confidence in the vote, if they're not willing to basically say you're ineligible for office after January 6th, then they are literally setting up the conditions to wipe away all democratic freedoms, because that wipes away competitive elections. Is this the program of public discourse event? Sorry.
I just, I see there's a hand in the back. I don't know where the other microphone went, but while we're getting there, I made a face at the end of your comments, Shannon, because you mentioned about it being a hard decision to make. I don't think it's a hard decision to make. I think it's hard to break with traditions of journalism that were formed in eras when there were a ton of people who were not in the room when these norms are being made and shaped and formed. And while we can't go back and put the people in the room, the people are in the room. Look around, we're in the room. The policies that we are using to report on someone like Donald Trump have to change. There's absolutely no reason that they shouldn't have changed by now. Like a study I've been working on is about the AP style book and how, I want to say it was 2019, finally added an edition for racism. So now journalists, you can call something racist or say it is racism. And if you look at coverage prior to that, there is a lot of hands off about calling something what it is. And that is the problem with not having multiple voices, multiple races, multiple perspectives, multiple gender identities in the room when we're making these decisions. And in these newsrooms where the decisions on how to report on Donald Trump are being made, the people are there. And there are editors who are deciding that we are going to stick with the status quo and the rules that we've always taught in spaces like this one, rather than adapting and changing for what Trump and his ilk are banking on. That is that you will stick to what you know, what the practices have historically been, and you will, in turn, continue to amplify our messages. The decisions aren't hard to make, the people just aren't willing to make them.
Yeah, I just want to say, I 100% agree with it. And I think I was thinking more like literally on the individual level, like when I've talked to local journalists, like have expressed fear about covering Trump in different ways or candidates who are similar, because they're like literally scared for what people in their community will do to them. But like, and so that's hard in and of itself, but it's also hard because if you don't change the coverage, then you are playing a role in making sure that we have a society where violence is accepted and threats are accepted and election outcomes are not. This is, I guess, that, and then, yeah, it's hard, but I also,
Yes.
Can I also just add something to this? These norms of coverage, not calling something what it is, not clearly rejecting election denialism, this does Republicans a disservice too, right? Like it means that like there are millions of Republicans who reject what happened on January 6th, including most in Congress, at least initially, until the political calculus changed and they had to articulate something else. The challenge is that when the media does not do its job in providing that first draft of how we should think and understand something, particularly democratic norms like contested elections, you give no space to all those pro-democratic Republicans, or in any other country, any opposition party that's pro-democratic in the sense of pro-elections, right? Pro-winning power, losing power. You're doing a disservice to all those other people who want to have a substantive debate on the state of the economy, who reject racism and believe in things like a more inclusive America, but might have different policy ideas about the role of the state in that. There's a wide latitude of legitimate debate and discourse to be had within both of these parties. But the fact that one of our main parties has been hijacked by an extremist, and that media in part have not done their jobs to keep him away from levers of power to undermine American democracy, does all of us small d Democrats a disservice.
All right, we have another question back here.
First, Daniel, wow, that's amazing, and it could be in the program for public discourse. I mean, that was not. I appreciate that. Small D or big D. Shannon, do you think the world would be a better place without the New York Times?
my mental sanity is sort of hinging on me being able to play my little word games for a little bit every day.
So Wordle, yeah, okay, now let's say the Washington Post bought Wordle. Do you think the world would be a better place without the New York Times?
I think if we are a society that cares about trying to acknowledge that there will always be power differentials, but try to not have gigantic ones where one media outlet plays the most outsized role that one can imagine, not only just in our country, but around the world. Yeah, I think it could be great if we didn't have one news organization that like study after study finds literally sets the agenda for news, not only in this country, but around the world. Because no matter how many people get in the editorial board rooms at the New York Times, it's still got this outsized power. And what we know about power is that power corrupts, right? And so when you have this gigantic differential between the power of one organization vis-a-vis others, I don't think that's good. I don't think that's good for
So in the world we have, where it is playing the role it is, you wish it weren't here.
Yes, yes. I will say that.
Thank you. Just,
No, I'm gonna jump in. I know she wasn't asking, but.
I'm against her because of the statement but I'd love to hear.
Well, so we've got this term news avoidance, right? News avoidant, people aren't using different news sources or they're trying to tune news out and whatnot. Having been a practicing journalist, right? I have found that I had to end my New York Times subscription. I had to stop seeking them for information because the picture of the United States and the world that the New York Times is creating through its ability to socially construct reality is dramatically skewed. It is skewed, as Nikki Usher has written, rich, white, and blue, right? And that is not real. But they continue to put out this coverage that makes it real. So the New York Times, like I used to love the housing section and what you could look at people's apartments and all that good stuff. Who can afford a house? We've got a major housing crisis because people cannot afford to live, but you wouldn't know it by looking at the New York Times. But I think about the resources that are concentrated in one area like that one, and we could look at basically any industry and say, if you took the resources that are concentrated in the leader in this particular field and you redistributed them on local levels, on regional levels, how might that change the outcome? How might it change the news that we get, the coverage we get, and our understanding of our realities, not just on a global scale, because there'll continue to be global publications and global publications of size. But how might it change the reality about the world that we know around us and how we're able to deal with those realities close by?
I have a question about the content moderation portion of the talk. This is the first draft as well, so stay with me now. So if we're like flagging certain types of misinformation on Instagram or Twitter or anything like that, how do you reconcile with the fact that people who are in those like far right conspiracy QAnon communities will look at that flag or that like suppression as confirmation that what you're saying is like true and the deep state doesn't let you know, or like government, like this is information they don't want you to know, like they're trying to flag you, they're trying to like, you know, stop this information from getting out there. I think that can like confirm those beliefs and send them to other platforms that won't regulate. And it'll send them or like Gab or any one of those platforms. How do you like deal with that?
I mean, and Morgan, if you want to jump in here too, because you study international conspiracies as well. This is the struggle. I mean, this is exactly the struggle that most platform companies find themselves in. So one of the things that we do know, for instance, is that from a long line of literature now, deplatforming works, right? So when QAnon was deplatformed, when Stop the Steal was deplatformed, we know that even though those places went to other sites, they no longer have the reach and visibility that they had before. So this is why platform companies view what they consider to be dangerous conspiracies like QAnon as something that is worth deplatforming from their site. Because it does reduce their reach and visibility. Now, that does not solve the problem that there's many other places where they could go. Telegraph is a great example, right? Although now that their founder is indicted, I don't know sort of what the future of Telegraph is going to be. But that was always the concern, because once they move off there to 4chan or somewhere else, it becomes less visible, less trackable, and in essence, it becomes part of their story. Well, we're deplatforming because we were telling the truth. I mean, this is exactly what Alex Jones did after Sandy Hook. This is exactly what other people have sort of done and pivot to be able to sort of claim that sort of morally righteous stance vis-a-vis platform, what they would call platform censorship. So there is no good answer there. I think the things that I would say is sort of taking it down, as we know, we do have evidence that reduces the spread. It also means then, and I think Francesca's written about this, or our colleague Alice Marwick has written about this, it then means that those outside groups then work to sort of launder that information through other means, right? Trading from other far-right groups into public discourse. This is actually part of the story of how we ended up talking about immigrants eating pets, was because in essence, some right-wing activists were able to trade that information up the chain from certain corners of the internet all the way up to Trump, right? So that stuff might have been taken down in other contexts, but they sort of found amplifiers who could then sanitize the story and tell it in different ways. But you're exactly right, it's a central dilemma.
We have other questions.
Oh, thank you for being here. Mine is like, whatever the step before first draft is, it's like a 0 draft, but I'm gonna try to vocalize it. So for lack of a better word, we live in a very increasingly memeable society. So back to the whole pet conversation, after the debate, it blew up on TikTok, this trend of Trump saying they're eating the cats, and then it's a video of a cat, and he gets scared and he runs away. It's all ha ha funny. And like, I laughed at it before. I'm sure other people in this room have laughed about it before. And then it hits me that, oh, this is causing a rise in racism and hate crimes. It actually isn't funny. And you would think a trend like that were to kind of promote the Harris Walls campaign, because it's saying the other candidate is saying silly things like this. But when you really think about it, it's turning it into like a smaller trivial thing, like, oh, it's just a joke, like, you kind of distance yourself from the fact that a presidential candidate actually said that, because now it's just a TikTok meme. And I don't know how many other Hussman students are in here, but for the future of journalists and PR professionals, I mean, at our core, whether we want to be or not, we have an increasingly political job. Even if our we or whatever isn't rooted in politics, politics is all over our jobs. So where do you think we go from here as professionals when anything you say or do, no matter how serious, can and will be turned into a meme, especially when Gen Z are such important voters and they're the ones consuming this content? Sorry, that was a lot.
No, I think it was great. I have like so many thoughts about this, so it's not, doesn't seem first draft to me. So I want to start by returning to the idea of what Meredith brought up of like absurdity, right? Absurdity, you know, certainly makes us feel like that there may be no opportunity, right, to change our fate. I also think absurdity invites spectatorship, and for us to think of ourselves as spectators to the absurdity of the arena, right, that we are in. And that means that we're living a little bit at a remove from the impact of the statement, of the voting choices, you know, that one might make. And I struggle with this, you know, because I think on the one hand, like, that's not good, right? Like, we should be thinking about the impact of this, and the absurdity, you know, and creating us into sort of spectators can take that away from us, right? Like, it's not happening to me, I'm just watching, and, you know. But on the other hand, I also think if we took everything that's going on around us seriously, deeply, every moment, all the time, and we didn't find time to have a little joy at the cat being like, ah, you know, and like running in the other room, then like, man, like, I don't know, I wouldn't be able to be sitting up here in front of you, you know? And so I don't have a good answer for the balance on that. It's something I've actually been thinking about a lot, because I have been talking to, you know, I talk to our undergrads here. I also was a high school journalist, so like anytime a high school journalist emails me, I'm like, yes, when do you want to talk? I'm available, whenever. And so I've been talking like a ton of high school journalists like about the election. And I have noticed something that like, this is like this is my pre-first draft of like a research thing I've been thinking about, which is like, young folks now have come for the most part into their political socialization in this age of absurdity, right? And I have heard more from the undergrads that I talk to, the high school students that I talk to, that are like, why isn't anyone taking this seriously? Seriously, they're what is on TikTok? This isn't funny. And they're really worried that people aren't taking it seriously. And at first I was like, chill, like we can do both. But then I thought, well, look at the context in which these people have grown up. They've not experienced and lived and seen a you can do both, right? And so of course they feel like, hello, is anyone taking this seriously, you know? And so I'm really interested in trying to think about how do we find that balance, because I do think the balance of like being able to laugh at things, laugh at ourselves, find joy is so important, especially in the absurdity that we're living in, but not at the extent of demobilizing, not at the extent of, you know, us not understanding the stakes, right, of what is going on. I don't have a good answer for like the balance on that, but I think there's something going on sort of generationally that I think we need to try and understand better and contend with as communicators, you know, again, wherever you're communicating from, like that, I think that we need to sort of, I think we need to figure this out a little bit better.
I also want to just add that the ambiguity is so important, especially in the age of absurdity, which I'm going to take, I love this, because the ambiguous internet, the memes are designed for you to be confused.
Mhm.
Is this video making fun of a presidential candidate that would say something so absurd? Or is this meme reproducing that harm? It's both, right? Or sometimes it's just one, right? And so it's interesting, like, how we decode these messages and what is the information going into this and why that ambiguity is so important for denying any kind of culpability or any sort of ownership over that. I think it's also really key. Just gonna throw myself in here again, so I'm on the panel.
Let me shout out the second half of the school, like, so from the Stratcom perspective, your job then is to use that context to your advantage to convey the seriousness and or weaken your opponent, right? So like, if you're an immigrants' rights group, how are you going to respond to this in order to, I mean, I would be right out there raising money, right? To give back to those communities right away, whether that's tied to a meme or not. If I was doing voter reg, I would use this as a way to mobilize people, to get people registered to vote, and then I would work to turn them out, right? So from the Stratcom perspective of this school, like, think about that as an opportunity to advance your goals and set it on your terms. Because I often think that what we were talking about before, the people who propagate these things do so to their advantage, not to the advantage of the causes that we might care about as communicators. And it's wresting that back and stopping to be reactive and to flip that to an advantage where you have the agency to take communicative action.
I wanted to add just a little bit of historical context to the question. I think it's easy for us to be discouraged, and again, thinking about absurdity and absurdity when we are wrestling against what seems like insurmountable forces, that nothing will change and that we're just kind of stuck here. Internet memes in particular operate in a way that separate us from historical precedent, that we are watching what looks like this totally ridiculous thing unfold about people eating cats and dogs, right? But it's predicated on a couple of different histories. And I think if we slow down and take the time, and I think this is where those social media influencers who like stop and here, let me break down what this means and what the historical implications are. I think that's where that is so useful. And again, doing some of that strategic communication work to show people things like, all right, I made this oblique reference earlier. When I was growing up in the 80s and 90s, the rumor was that the local Chinese restaurants were serving cats, right? That is a mimetic idea that crossed the country, and wherever a restaurant sprang up, you know, if they got a bad health report or if they were just a competitor to someone, that is what people said to drive public opinion about that particular place, and also immigrant groups that were connected to a certain kind of cuisine. We have seen these examples of memes in other forms. It's just that on the internet, they move faster, they are more clever, they are on apparatus that get us to spend more time online and think less about the substance of what's being communicated and more about its shock value and the entertainment value. And to add a final piece about historical context, I go back to someone out here knows which election this was. Michael Dukakis yeah.
So we had the tank.
Thank you. Michael Dukakis, Democratic candidate for the presidency from Massachusetts, had this moment where he was in an army tank and he's supposed to be projecting this era of strength. But it became a meme, pre-internet, because we saw it on the nightly news for weeks and months, and it completely tanked his campaign. And we got to think about what happens, how do you communicate something effectively, or how do you combat a message that has taken on mimetic properties such that it does subvert the message that the person who put it out is trying to send. So there's history there. There are examples there. We've seen it done before. It's just our job to really dig in and find the solutions and how we're going to start addressing some of these conflicts as they arise, recognizing that they're not without precedent.
Do we have any other questions, comments? I recognize that we've already asked. No?
So just a quick comment, I understand the criticism against New York, but I wanted to respectfully say that that's a very good newspaper. And they have done a comprehensive job of covering some of the issues. I know there are occasional issues, and so on First Amendment Day, I wanted to appreciate the fact that the New York Times is a successful media model. And I know you can find 6 things wrong, but I can also share 6 things that are right about the New York Times, and I pay my money to get the New York Times. Thank you.
And I'm going to respectfully disagree with you, Deb, and disrespectfully disagree with the New York Times. I think the New York Times has been, and for me, as a journalist, that was the pinnacle. That's where I wanted to work. One of the proudest moments of my life was giving a talk at the New York Times. But I think the Times has been derelict in its duty to report accurately, fairly, and thoroughly on any number of issues. And I'm not just talking about Donald Trump. I'm talking about everything from the housing crisis to the outcome of the so-called racial reckoning of 2020 to our economy, to foreign policy, to conflicts in other lands. There are so many problems with the layers of editing, and we see it every time there's a major scandal at the Times. They go through their editorial process and they say, yeah, there was something that was supposed to happen in this layer of editing. And I chalk it up to the fact that the organization is so big that it is failing, and it's failing in ways that it doesn't necessarily have to.
All right, we're almost done on time, but I guess I just want to end with one last thing so we can talk. We've been using the phrase mis and disinformation a lot. And within our field, we think about how that is layered with intentionality, so the difference. And like, does intent, we've talked a lot about this, but what role does intent play? Because it's such a key part of a lot of content moderation. But does it matter? Like, should we just say one thing? About it.
I think this, the intentionality of it, is like basically pretty impossible to ever find out. And I think that we use that as a criterion on purpose. And I think platform companies use that as a criterion on purpose to make it harder to call some things disinformation, right? Because we say, well, we can't understand the intent of what the person or group was, even though it's usually plainly obvious what the intent was. And so I think it functions in a particular way when we think about how it actually sort of plays out.
I'm gonna respectfully disagree with this, since that.
Are we having to satisfy?
So to me, this is very similar to the debate over lying and how journalists cover lying, right? And some journalistic outlets would say, you can never say someone's lying because you're not inside their head, and you don't know their state or their intent. The reality is, like, we have whole bodies of professional practice that exist to determine motivation and intent, right? The law is one of them. Something I've written a lot about very recently, human rights, bodies of human rights work, where they think a lot about intent of perpetrators of certain forms of violence, et cetera. To me, there are certain things you can think about when you think about this information, right? Like, is it in someone's interest to circulate this story? Start swinging us over to the intent side. Do they benefit from it in some way? Do the groups that they represent benefit from this in some way? Does it work to uphold certain structures of power, whether that's about gender or race or class, in ways that create a more favorable environment for them and their interests to be served in the future? All of those things I've been very useful using the word disinformation and at least sort of arguing that there is an intent there to tilt the playing field unfairly in their favor.
Yeah, okay, great. So we're not fighting. That's what I meant, is that because those steps that you just said are like pretty obvious, but also provide enough cover for people, whether it's in the press or within platforms, to say like, well, we can't determine that, then intent becomes a purposeful obfuscation, even when it is plainly obvious that's what the intent of something is.
I would just say that I would like us to take up the question on multiple levels, that we not think about just the primary intent, but also the secondary and tertiary intent of disinformation or misinformation as it's circulated. And I bring it back to the example where we started about this mimetic reference about immigrants eating cats and dogs. The primary intent was to get attention, right? The secondary intent is to focus attention on immigrant populations wherever they are. Forget it being Springfield, Ohio. Are there different people who have come from a different country who we can pin America's problems, especially America's economic anxieties on? Great, let's use this as a mechanism to do that. The tertiary intent there, mobilize the base. Get my people so angry about what they think is happening or what's rumored to be happening that they show up and vote in ways, and also intimidate and threaten others in ways that they have an advantage at the ballot box and other people don't show up.
I had so much fun. That's all I'm gonna say. I love y'all. Thank you for your time.
Thank you all for joining us for the CITAP panel. The day is not done, so if your schedule permits, know that there is a trivia contest that's gonna happen in here for which you can win prizes. There will also be dinner out in the hallway before the keynote, and so that is still what is on the agenda. So thank you so much for our CITAP team, and the day is not over. Thank you.